all women who are classified or identified by the state as native carry a form of pass. And so what I've been doing as I was busy revising the paper and also after completing it is I'm working with I was about to say I'm working with material from the early 1940s, but it's actually not true. I'm firmly stuck, as I always tend to be, in the 1930s. So I'm doing trying to do a fine-grained reading of Ilanga KwaZulu-Natal of 1939 at the moment, and it's meant to be part of an effort to look at what happens with women's writing in Ilanga and the whole, thematic of gender politics in Ilanga, as in the early years of the Second World War. And what's important to keep in mind is that so the various pieces of work that I've done so far, working with this particular newspaper, is all situated at a time when the newspaper is quite, perhaps more than other South African newspapers, is very much a newspaper of what I call, in my paper, writerly readers. And so it's a paper in which letters to the press or letters to the editor features very prominently, and readers are often also the pen men and later the pen women of all kinds of reports and other material that gets placed in the newspaper. And that format of the newspaper is, one can see, continues until somewhere in 1943, when the long-time editor of the newspaper, whose editor, I'm not sure of my dates now, but from the middle 1910s until 1943, Ngazana Luthuli, he retires in 1943, and more or less at that time is when there's a whole lot of factors that conspire, perhaps, such as shortage of paper and so on during the war, but the format of the paper changes, it's reduced, and there's a kind of a new version of what the modern format might be that excludes, that reduces the letters to the editor pages considerably. So yeah, so that's a larger area within which I'm working, and I'm interested in this kind of shift that one can see from the middle 1930s onwards towards what I call partly one can try and make an argument for a feminized Ibandla, or feminized, to use Hlonipho Mokuna's words, a feminized, she talks about the Ilanga KwaZulu-Natal's assembly of readers. So women becoming explicitly writers and recognized by the editor and other journalists in Ilanga as important readers of the newspaper. I also, it may also be useful to know that the paper, so the history of this particular paper, and Tembisa in particular will remember this, that it originated as a subsection of the paper that was also published in Ilanga KwaZulu-Natal and co-authored by myself together with my former student Palesa Nzuza, and that we called Isifazane Sagite Emadolobene, Our Women in the Towns, The Politics of Gender in Ilanga KwaZulu-Natal, 1933 to 1938. And so in that paper, we looked at how at first there's a sort of a period where women and what women do and what women are doing in the towns of Natal become a topic of discussion, but mostly a topic of discussion between men in editorials and in letters in the newspaper. And so I'm just trying to think of the phrase that was used in, oh yeah, okay. So letters might be headlined, or Pendulela isifazane. So on the one hand, there were these headings in the paper. The paper was experimenting with how to identify certain interests of readers through sort of banners at the top of the page. So you'd have a page that's got the banner, Izintombi Zagiti, or so our girls. There's editorials about Isifazane Zagiti Emadolobeni, our women in the towns. And there are letters of people, of men speaking for women, or so Pendulela, if it's Isifazane, to speak for women. But by the end of the period, this paper discussed by kind of the first half of 1938, there's a fully fledged women's page, which has been transmogrified from the kind of male editor's effort to create a ladies' page in 1937 to a page that's written in Zulu, and that's called Ikazi Lamakosikazi, and where they are explicit, the main columnist of the page, who is somewhat mysteriously called by the pen name Nomabunu, she writes quite often about the importance of women writing for themselves. So she talks that it's important that that women write and speak up for themselves. And so what was a background to this, I was conscious as I was writing, and the piece that I then extracted from this paper, which became far too long, was a kind of a blow-by-blow account that I put together working with snippets of information in Ilanga and with material from the Tekwini Municipal Archives that was about that concerned this whole question of the effort of the Kopolecheni, as Ilanga says in Zulu, so the Durban Corporation, to enlarge or to extend the sort of regulations that existed for men in Durban to women. And so so according to this new regime, women would have to carry a form of, women would have to apply for permission to come to town, and they would have to carry a form of a sort of a certificate, which would kindly be provided by the municipality so that they could prove their legitimacy in Durban. And what I ended up with was a paper that I thought of as a rather frustratedly a kind of an old-fashioned social history paper that just detailed this women's protest and struggle and the successful effort to push against this new set of regulations, which really came to a head in terms of the conflict in early 1937. So what I've done with this paper is I sort of set myself the challenge to continue with the project of thinking about and analyzing print culture in Ilanga Natal. So think about to pay attention to the politics of the page, and to look at how so I literally last year when I worked on this, I literally went back to each instance in Ilanga where I had found some article that mentioned this the pass law regulations, or an article of or that mentioned say a report about a meeting of Daughters of Africa where passes for women had been discussed, and I looked at what else is on the page. And I played with what happens when I pay almost as much attention to other issues being debated in the newspaper. And what then emerged was, I think, hopefully a richer discussion about how the newspaper positions itself within the context of the sort of, you know, the tightening of the screws of segregatory rule in the 1930s. you know, the on the one hand, and the way in which the paper almost articulates the aspirations of the kholwa elite on the other. And so you can see that at the you know, the introductory paragraphs of the paper, I literally play with, I looked at, this is the first mention in 1935, if I don't have the whole paper in front of me now, but I think it was somewhere in March 1935, where the first mention was bland little article about women. Let's just see if I can maybe share my screen. I'm trying to see where the share screen is there. Okay, let's hope you can actually see this and not other stuff. So can you see this?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so right at the bottom of the page, I've just got the top half of the page here. It says, Isifazana Sabantu Namadolopa. And then there's the other, the editorial Ubukosi Obufanele that I discuss in the introduction. And the photograph of Shieni. And you can see here, this is a typical, in every edition of Ilanga and Lasinatal, there'll be this section, excuse my Zulu pronunciation, please, but Izinda Chana and Gezinto Nabantu. So these little snippets, social snippets about, of people about town, yeah. In the later on in the paper, this is a page that I also analyze extensively. Again, there's an article to the right of in the section that says Ezaneno na Peshea. So it's a regular of the paper column that presents local and overseas news. And there's a kind of an account of the new law that does not present any critical analysis. It simply blandly or factually presents it. Editorial next to it, which I analyze, and then this very interesting article on the right, Ungidi El-Wandle, which once I started to work with it together with Welela Tele, who I leaned on extensively to assist me with the translation, became just a totally fascinating account of a cultural event, of a get together between sort of liberal whites in Durban and from Durban and the Inanda area, who are very closely tied to kholwa politics and history, including the Campbells. So the first subsection of the paper actually set out to not analyze Ilanga, but work with another, with the municipal archives that I had in hand. It's one thick and rich file that specifically is devoted to this topic of proposed compulsory registration of Native women, subject 359C. And I played with different strategies of reading that. So the first few pages, I work with a couple of pages that one of the municipal officers actually prepared as a history of this set of contestations, and where they identify the beginning place, as it were, is a letter that was received from the Minister of National Affairs, and where it is proposed or advised that all so-called Native women should be treated as a single class. And then I try and sort of tease out some of the implications of that, in particular for kholwa women. What happens if all African women are treated as a single class? What is that? What are the implications for the kind of limited differential treatment that kholwa were still able to claim in Natal in the mid-1930s. But then I also sort of go back to the start of the file, and I try and read the unfolding. I want to see what happens if I literally delimit myself to paging through the file, because this is a file of bureaucratic correspondence that was filed as it was written. And so it starts in the middle of the story when the conflict is heating up. In terms of when to the apparent surprise of the officials, women are not queuing up for these certificates, which the officials keep insisting will just resolve all possible problems that the new regulations have created. And I also try and pay attention to almost the materiality of the documents. So you'll see that as part of my analysis. For example, this is the second letter on file. I tried to, it was very interesting to discover more about Clement Stott by finding out more about his firm of architects and land surveyors, and thinking about how the kind of conflict of the interests.
On to the next meeting now. Eric, go.
Some noise, I'm not sure where it's coming from.
Sorry, yes, Professor Erlang, I've muted her.
Yes. So I'm not sure where we are for time.
Maybe a minute or so, if you could just wrap up.
Yeah, okay. Let me just stop sharing. Let me just think if I can find something quickly. I can't remember now. Yeah, so part of what in the sort of the last third of the paper, I read some of the municipal correspondence together with material from Ilanga. So on the one hand, if you had time to read the paper, you would have seen that as so there are several, there were several deputations over those couple of years to the municipality, and then eventually women are, there are these specifically women's meeting that the municipality reports on, and then Isabel Selilo, Bertha Mkhize, and others from Daughters of Africa arrange this procession, as Ilanga Natal calls it, march, as I think it's referred to in the interview with Bertha Mkhize that I also draw upon. And so Ilanga actually it's quite interesting to think not only about the representation of women's politics in Ilanga, not only also how it's presented in English and how it's presented in isiZulu. So there's two front page, there's various front page article. I think this is the front page article, but there's also a report in Zulu. There are other front pages that I discussed that are specifically, as is more usual in Ilanga, include reports about sort of women's protest politics in Zulu. I was able to play these. So what's unusual and was very stimulating about the materials that I was working with is that I could look at how Ilanga, in the last part of the conflict, reports quite in some detail on what's happening. But I also had the minutes of meetings as written up by the municipality. And I suggest in the paper that it's really through the minutes of the municipality that one gets perhaps more strongly now I'm obviously speaking quite roughly, but so the women's words, as it were, are put down on paper in some detail in the minuted style of the municipality. And there's a moment in Bertha Mkhize's the interview that was done in the shortly before her death, in the late 1970s, if I remember correctly, where Mkhize talks about how they insisted, she and the other women leaders insisted on that they would not enter there'd been breaches of promise before, and they were not going to enter the premises of the court. They stayed in the space of the courtyard, and the magistrate or native commissioner was compelled to come out to speak in front of all the women. And she, with some amusement, recalls how there was this secretary who came with her typewriter or little machine and proceeded to take shorthand. And so I've got those minutes that were produced. And I could play that off against the version of events of Ilanga. So that's what I want to say, I think, for now. And let's see what emerges through the questions.
Thank you, Marijke. Very interesting indeed. And I think it's lovely, in part because our honours students especially are at the point where they're looking into their projects for their research essay. And one of the things that some of them are doing is thinking about possibly using newspapers like Ilanga and doing the kind of work with some of the African newspapers from the time period that you're looking at for their projects, in addition to other archives at UJ's Doornfontein campus. So I'm sure some of them will have some thoughts. So just a reminder, a couple of things I would want to point out, just a reminder to please mute yourself, and unless you are asking a question of our presenter, to leave your camera off, just so we can save data. And if you'd like to ask a question, to press the reactions button, which is at the bottom of the screen. And if you press that, you'll see an option to raise hand. If you click that raise hand button, it'll allow you to ask a question. So there are already some comments in the chat, but I would like to open up for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, please will you indicate as much to me. So Peter Lim, I think, Marijke, you'll probably be able to see that Peter Lim has pointed out that Bertha also wrote in isiZulu in the Workers' Herald, in a publication that it looks like Peter is editing shortly for the Historical Publications of Southern Africa organization. And I have a hand from Megan first. Megan Healy-Clancy, can you hear? Mute yourself, Megan. I'm not hearing you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, great. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with that. All right, thank you so much. I'll stop my video now that we've ascertained that works. Thank you, Marijke, for this paper. I was very excited about it. I remember finding that Durban Municipal Archive some years ago and finding a lot that confused me. So that simple sort of, what you describe as a sort of simple reconstruction, a sort of social history approach to illustrating what happened with the women there is in fact immensely valuable, and I really appreciate it. I'm really intrigued by this concept of class as you deployed in the paper. So certainly this idea of kholwa women wanting to, retain this sort of legal categorization they had, that makes a lot of sense. I was really interested though too, if you could think about sort of differences amongst the kholwa women you're studying. So on page 29, for instance, you talk very interestingly about the sort of singularity of Bertha Mkhize, being an unmarried woman, being a business owner, all of these other things, compared to Isabel Salilo, who's sort of more entrenched within the state, effectively through her husband. So I was wondering sort of, where your work might be taking you with that in terms of, kind of disaggregating these class categories of kholwa women and other women, and what difference you're seeing that things like marriage and generation might be making in terms of women's position in this political field. Thanks.
Are we taking questions one by one?
I think for now, yes, I think so.
Okay. Yeah, that's a nice question, Megan. I mean, I found that to start with, I just found that wording very intriguing. I was trying to see, I think I copied it down. Now I went outside because my room's so dark, but now I'm in the wind. Anyway, I can't find the exact thing now, but the Secretary of Native Affairs proposing to treat all African women or all Native women as a single class. It's so I'm losing my thread a bit. Yeah, but yeah, let me first speak more specifically to your question about kholwa women and sort of how I would differentiate between them. One thing that might not come out as strongly in this paper as in some of my previous work, if you think back to the first paper I did quite a few years ago now on sort of native welfare in Durban, and I looked at how I was interested in how the kholwa community in Durban discussed and acted around questions of poverty. So what intrigued me there was that someone like Isabel Sililo, whose husband is becomes the native welfare officer, they live in the native quarters in close to the harbour, and they don't own unlike some of the kholwa leaders who are based in Inanda, they don't own property. So if you look at say Isabel Salilo's husband's salary, it was about something like £5 a month, on which a family that had elite aspiration, any family would struggle to survive on, let alone a family where it's important to have reasonable shoes, to dress in a suit for work, etc., etc. So there are class differences in simple, traditional social history terms amongst the kholwa. And then there are also the differences that the interesting political differences that you reference and that I try and begin to discuss, where someone like Mkhize, she never marries, she had a business that she ran together with her one brother. She's financially independent. She is said to have lobolaed herself to enable her younger brothers to marry. And she comes from that in the 1920s. She's quite an activist in the ICU. And what my paper almost would be very interesting to be able to compare what she says in this context of the nationalist discourse of the 1930s, to see her writings in a worker, in the context of worker organization in the 1940s, occasionally in the early 1940s in Ilanga. She also writes as a trade union organizer. But certainly there is a sense in which Sililo, it's not only because of her husband, it's very much because she is working closely with the municipality, and she's acting as a broker, as it were, for access to welfare benefits. in her role as secretary for the Durban Bantu Welfare Society. So it's perhaps a more complicated game that she plays when she participates in that procession, and when they change the terms of what petitioneering entails in 1937.
Thank you, Marijke. So I have Amanda Mangana and then Julie Powell. Amanda.
Afternoon, everyone. My question is, firstly, I would like to say that this is quite interesting because my topic is similar to what Marijke is talking about. So my question is, did she find any inconsistencies between the newspaper articles and the municipal records? And if she did, how did you come up with the final what do I call it, decision, or which one to use or which one to trust? Thank you.
Amanda, that's a very nice question, thanks. Yes, so there were some differences in presentation of how especially that final march of the women unfolded. Although maybe I could see if I can share, I'm just going to try and find something and then I'll see if I can share some material with you. It's part of answering. Sorry, depends how quickly I find this set of, yeah, okay, got it. Okay, sorry, screen share. It's quite messy, excuse me, I just want to see if I can get to the right part. Yeah, so I want to be there. So here's an example of of an article on the front page of Ilanga. So some of these events that are being reported on here are also being, I also find sort of discussions amongst officials. So on the one hand, one of the differences that there would be that the officials kept insisting, and it was almost as if I had to try and read between the lines of what officials say in their letters to each other, because it seemed as if the letters are sometimes, as if officials might be conscious that the letters are a form of public record, which they, in which they are positioning themselves as part of the conflict. So, for example, the officials would write, they would promulgate a law themselves. They would promulgate a regulation. They would formulate a regulation in great detail, and then they would publish it in the Government Gazette. And then they would write to each other saying, this law has been published. The natives are getting restless. What will we do? As if it's almost writing as if it was, as if it wasn't, as if they were not the actors, and now we're kindly going to arrange matters so that the natives would not be distressed. So yes, one is constantly trying to understand the terms in which the kind of almost the discourse in the official correspondence itself. Then here, this was very interesting for me in terms of my own process of learning Zulu. where those of you who speak Zulu will see that in the first sentence, there's a metaphor that's being used where it says that so the headline says passes for women in Durban, and then it says that women in Durban are having I hope I'm doing my direct translation correctly. Women in Durban are having a cockroach inside their ears, and the the issue of passes have been awakened, greatly awakened. I'm not translating very well here, but so the article here is very much almost conveying the extent of agitation and anger in its language. But then once and here as well in the front page article, so it's quoting women. It coheres very closely with the minutes in the municipality. But once the issue is somewhat resolved, in this article, a happy end to the procession, in various ways, the article seems to be stressing the harmlessness of women's actions. So as you can see here, 400 Durban native women went wild with enthusiasm at the Native Affairs Department premises last Thursday. Old tribal customs assigned themselves, women forming long lines. So what's emphasized here is that the women were almost praising the Native Commissioner and responding very well. And Ilanga presents it as if the Native Commissioner was the hero of the day and managed to save the day. But when you look at the minutes of the official minutes of the meeting, it's a lot more confrontational. And it's clear that, while the Native Commission is saying all kinds of placatory things to women, refusing to concede certain aspects of segregationary policy, the women are quite extremely explicit about what they object against, and presented kind of a quite extensive critique of municipal policy.
Thank you, Marijke.
So just to say one last thing, I think Amanda, what I found was more productive was to almost not to try and find a truth of what happened, but to almost play those different representations off against each other in my writing.
Thank you, Marijke. I think that was a lovely question, Amanda, that really opened up the discussion nicely. And actually, Prudence, another one of our postgrads, just asked a follow-up question, which then you actually answered in that very moment, Marijke, which was precisely the question of kind of the differences in terms of how the key protagonists you're writing about were represented in the sources. So I have two questions lined up. I have Julie and Brian. Let's start with Julie.
Hi, Marijke. Hello, friends. Lovely to see you and be with you. Marijke, I'm wondering if you can put me right. What little I know about this march and the protest, I know from reading and quoting fairly unquestioningly the calling of Katie Makanya. And in the calling of Katie Makanya, she says that she was asked to lead this march, and that she consulted the doctor, James McCord, who was against it. But Margaret McCord agreed to march with the women, saying that the police, I think it is, I'm paraphrasing, would not dare to assault or take umbrage against the march of the women. Now, have you uncovered anything in either the archival or the Ilanga newspapers about Margaret McCord, the presence of white women or white supporters, or is this likely to have been something of a myth?
I don't know if anyone else can also chip in here, because I do remember quite long ago looking at Makanya as part of trying to unpick quite a lot of confused references to what may or may not have been the same march, and sometimes also different dates and years of dates mentioned. But this march was specifically, there were some men from the Natal ANC present, and some of the ministers of religion and so on, but I don't think that I have any, that it's not the way it's recorded. I don't think that that makes any sense.
Interesting. Okay, I don't know if Julie, you want to come back, otherwise we can move on. Julie?
Maybe in the calling out from Katie Makanya, a number of different marches were conflated.
I think so.
Yes,
I
okay.
think so.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks for that.
Peter, yeah. Peter in the
Thank you,
chat
Regan,
says
also
maybe it was an ICU march.
Okay.
Okay, great, that helps. Thank you.
All very interesting. So Brian is next.
Good day, Prof. I'm very much impressed of your Zulu, but a little bit concerned with how you always use direct translation. So I want to know how, like, don't you have problems with when you translate like idioms into English? Doesn't that like affect your research and understanding of the content in most of the cases that you're doing?
Thanks for the question. I think that, yeah, I mean, because it's my choice is to translate directly, because I'd rather have people play with and think about the direct translation than find an equivalent metaphor in English, which often doesn't quite exist. So I know it's imperfect, but I'd rather sort of once or twice, I think in the paper, I've worked with a direct translation, but then as part of the discussion of the quote, one almost embroiders a bit on what the idiom, you know, the meaning of the kind of, what's the right word? The sort of layered meanings of the idioms involved. But so something like that first sentence that I showed you, the sort of image of the cockroach, is something that I wasn't familiar with at all, and I was just stumped when I tried to read the paragraph by myself. And then Mwelela explained, and Mwelela Tele, in one of our sort of Zoom discussions where we sit with the article and we talk through it, explained the idiom to me. So some of my analysis then also built in and drew on his explanation. But I agree with you that it sort of can read quite problematic as a way of rendering the metaphorical language. But I think because the Zulu is also in the text,
All right. Sorry, I briefly actually cut out. I'm on a slightly unreliable internet myself. I have a raised hand from Tembisa, but I'm also looking for other hands. Tembisa.
Thanks, Marijke, for your paper and presentation. I adore your work, so I'm very glad to be part of this presentation. I'm trying to rack my brains to, it's got to be more than a decade, when I was working a little bit on the case of the Lorem School and Bowmanville. And I seem to remember that around this same time, there were contestations manifestations. You mentioned it in your paper also about limited housing and this kind of foot dragging by the municipality to expand housing. But and also with the schooling. And I think it was around this time that they were thinking also about expanding the Lorem School to accommodate more learners. I wondered if in your readings of the newspaper, whether those kinds of issues featured in the discussion about, you know, women entering the city and, you know, this concern with women living with Indians, for example. I presumed that would be in the magazine Barracks, which were right next to Bowmanville. So I'm wondering about the architecture of the city and the issue of you know, the expanding population of children and the needs for education and so on. If you could just say a little more about that.
Just see. Yeah, I mean, so I think what does emerge in this particular paper is that when women talk about why it is important to access, to be able to live in the city, live in town. The question of education, access to schooling, and is particularly important. This was indeed a period in which there was a lot of frustration about housing and the municipalities foot dragging in this regard. And so whenever in these meetings, just trying to remember now, the question of the documents that they were trying to make women carry were never taken up by women as a single issue, as the issue that they addressed when they spoke with municipal officials. They did so as part of a general critique of the policy of segregation, and as part of that, they also talked extensively about the lack of the fact that the municipality needed to provide more suitable housing. So that was very much at the forefront. There is a whole, the whole question about schooling. I'd need to look at that in more detail. The question that you raise about the insufficient sort of places at school and that not enough schooling opportunities were available for growing African population in the city. But the period that the material that I'm reading at the moment from the late 1930s, there's a lot of discussion both about housing, because there was some more housing provided by the late 1930s, not only in Durban but also in Maritzburg. And so it's a constant topic for discussion in the newspaper, also with regards to the sort of politics of love and marriage, because there's a lot of resentment in 39 about women who dare to say that young men should offer homes in the city to prospective their girlfriends and wives. And then there's a lot of discussion about the nature of so-called native education at the time, and what is on offer, and the proposed changes to native education. So it's something that could be studied in a lot more detail in the newspaper. And indeed, if I am to take this project forward in terms of what women are writing about, then that's a big topic.
Thank you, Marijke. You'll see that Thembiso sent a follow-up, and as did Peter. Peter, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Yeah, okay. Thanks. My question is really about authorship in a lot of these editorials in particular. Jordan Ngubane, who comes on board in about 1938, just after these women's protests, and worked with Ngazana, always saw him as a faithful clone, sort of a cipher of John Dubé. And so I've been looking at the earlier decades and trying to unravel who is actually speaking in unsigned articles. And to some extent with repartees, you can see the style of John Dubé, especially when he's replying to people like Champion and JT Gumedi. He gets quite hot under the collar. And everything that Jordan Ngubane and the Dlomo brothers say about Ngazana is that he wasn't that sort of political person. You know, he was mainly busy in the choir. So I just wondered, Marijke, whether you managed to perceive Ngazana's actual voice and style in this period that you looked at very closely, and a wonderful paper. Congratulations on it.
I mean, I have been worrying about misattributing editorials because I'm frustrated that I don't have enough of a sense of this sort of the regular, right, the editorial team in Ilanga for the period and the journalists. So, for example, you know, you can see some of the regular columnists like AC Maseko. I think, if I remember correctly, is one of them, but it took me a while even to distinguish between, and there's a blurred area between columnists and letter writers. It's not always clear whether something is placed in a letter or whether it's someone writing as an Ilanga journalist or columnist. And of course the editorials, I may be thinking that it's Ngazana because he's, in a simplistic way, because he's editor of Ilanga, and then there might be a kind of a rotating group of people writing editorials.
Yes.
And I'm a bit frustrated. I don't know how to get away from that at the moment. The other thing is that what you're saying about Jordan Ngubane might make some sense, of helping make some sense with other trends. For example, so the period that follows from this paper, like the latter 1938 and especially 1939, I get the sense that there's an effort to sort of freshen up the paper, and some changes made in its format. And now and then there's a letter from someone who congratulates the sort of new editorial team, wording something like that. And I don't, at the same time, you know, there is nowhere in the paper where an editorial team is listed. So I need to figure a way to, and that's just a weakness of mine at the moment, of, you know, understanding some of this, the background, you know, the sort of changing of the guard at Ilanga and how that happens, and how one can read that through the tutorial. So, I mean, there's quite what Mwelela calls quite sort of flowery language in the editorializing about segregation that happens very often in Ilanga at this time, in the middle to late 1930s, that I've assumed is in Ngazana Luthuli.
Thank you, Marijke. It's fascinating. I'm still looking for hands. I think we could probably manage at maybe about 10 more minutes. I see Natasha coming. I was just going to pop my question into the pool. In a way, it piggybacks a little. Sorry, Marijke.
Sorry, no, it's Natasha who's got a hand.
Yes, yeah. I'll come to Natasha now. I was just going to throw mine in. Let's take back to back, actually. In a way, it goes back to Megan's question at the start, which is, in a way, I was hoping for a slightly more sociologically specified discussion of class in the paper. And I think partly, I suppose one way of asking this question is to say, what investment did the core woman that you're looking at have in the distinction between the kind of respectable and unrespectable poor themselves? I think it's clear. I think we know what it is on some level, and I think it's implicit in your paper. But you know, obviously, as I think actually Kathy Eales's work, which I don't think that maybe I missed it. I didn't see cited in the paper. I think on Joburg, and it's the same moment and very similar politics, brings this out quite nicely. Yeah, and then I immediately thought of other instances of this kind of politics at work. So Mongia's essay on Satyagraha, the protest in 1913, talks about the kind of role of this, almost like a national discourse of honor, obviously. And Keith's book has a discussion of this with regards to fingerprinting too, the similar kind of gender discourse. But anyway, those are just, I put those out there. Natasha?
Thank you, everyone, and really fascinating. Thanks, Marijke. I was actually wanting to piggyback on to the last discussion, and I wondered if I could draw you out a bit more, and I guess this refers to Peter as well, about to what extent is it important to try and trace individual writers in editorials. I'm thinking more of some of the arguments that have been made, for instance, about the West African newspaper writing, where people say that things like lack of attribution are deliberate strategies to capitalize, excuse the word in the context of class, on the fact that different people sometimes get the task of writing the editorial, but you want to maintain a consistent style. So that what happens then is that it's possible to pick up a change. Thank you, Megan. I was having a blonde moment. No, I can't say that. Apologies. Sorry, I have to work out what the correct phrase is for a moment of complete forgetfulness. Stephanie Newell. To what is the extent is it an important question to identify individual authors compared to trying to look for a particular kind of stance or viewpoint? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll have to think about that more. I think that is an interesting, your comment is distracting me into thinking about other issues I have, or conundrums I have with sort of pen names and what's skuilnaam in Afrikaans, what is the English now for that? Pseudonyms that are also commonly used in the newspaper. So yeah, I think about that. The question about the editorial, who exactly is in charge of Ilanga as editor, perhaps becomes more important to me when there are significant changes in who is able to write in the paper. So, for example, I've been trying to think about. It seems that it is when Luthuli retires that the women's loss of the sort of the space closes down for women to write in the paper. But on the other hand, generally speaking, more generally, there are far fewer letters to the newspaper when he retires in 1943. So I've thought around that, or speculated about the fact that his wife was in DOA, in the Daughters of Africa, in Amadodakazi as Africa, and that when he's edited, there is this opening created for women's writing. The other question, I mean, I could play with your argument with regard to this column that I'm trying to read more extensively at the moment. That's called Ezethu Nabisifazane, the amongst us women, by Nomabunu, who's got this very intriguing pen name. Amabunu being the word for Boers, and I've not been able to figure out who she is. So here's I'm working with a column with extensive columns of writing by someone who articulates particular arguments of African nationalism, and I don't know who it was.
Yeah. So there's more comments in the chat. I think what I'll do is I will obviously forward you the comments in the chat as well, Marijke, because I think you may find that helpful. I think we can probably do one last call for any questions, especially perhaps some of our postgrads. Actually, while we wait to see if anyone wants to do a final question, Natasha, do you have the link, or maybe it actually would be Natasha, for our postgrads to the Ilanga database at UJ? Because I think it's important to say, at no point has anyone said, how do you access the old issues of the back issues of Ilanga? Are there any other questions? I don't know if Natasha is frantically searching for the link as I speak.
I've just got one comment about something that I discovered in the course of my research. Maybe just to say on this whole question of Ilanga, it's kind of at a slightly interesting and slightly frustrating stage, because I'm working with paper copies, which is very nice for this period at National Library, South African National Library in Cape Town, but I'm not allowed to photograph them. They've scanned them, but I can't access the scans except paying for them one by one. So, it's still such a sort of a mosaic of different forms of access depending on the period you're working on. But the one little detail that I wanted to highlight, in case someone has insight, is that fairly towards the end of my writing up the paper, I suddenly discovered that something that I'd never known, that in 1935, Durban attained the status of a city as opposed to a town in the kind of state categorization, governmental categorization. And I'd worked on Durban for years, and I'd never somehow realized this. And a repercussion, moreover, of Durban becoming a city, being classified as a city, was that municipal officials seemed, after the fact, it became clear that this meant that most policing functions would be taken over by South African police, which had hitherto all policing function in Durban had fallen under the borough police or the municipal police. So that I'd been happily analyzing this conflict, the height of the conflict being that there were police raids conducted on police raids on homes at the African homes in the city, and I'd been kind of dismissive of all these letters from municipal officials saying, well, we don't have control of the police. It's regarding those letters as completely duplicitous. But then right at this point of the height of this particular conflict is when there's a changeover. It happens just pretty much when South African police have taken over in town. So I found that really interesting, and so a lot of the references that are being made in Ilanga of Boer police and how they're absolutely shockingly insulting, and that they seek out opportunities to insult respectable Africans in particular, was kind of, that changeover was part of the context. So I'd be very interested if people have, I know of research that's been done about this, but it just added a very interesting detail.
It's very interesting. It did remind me a little bit of Keith Shear's essay, I think in that volume of gender that started out in Gender and History and then was published as an edited volume that Nancy Hunt co-edited, maybe with Lynn Thomas and maybe Stefan Misha, which was about, the Keith Shear's essay was about the kind of culture of policing in the transition from to union, and specifically how women, and here he's talking about white women, were pushed to the side as kind of figures who wanted to kind of shape policing in a slightly less punitive, more reformist direction. Anyway, that's all by way of saying that that is a very interesting point that you have discovered that we should all have been paying attention to, Marijke. I want to thank you for a very, very good paper and a very good discussion. And I just want to point our postgraduates especially to the link that I posted in the chat, which is, if you click on it, once you enter your UJ login details, will take you straight to the Ilanga volumes that have been scanned from 1903 to about 1922. So you too can look through these volumes and be part of this conversation, and we certainly hope that you will.
Just to say something about those volumes, you can have a lot of fun by, remember that they're word searchable. So if you, for example, put in the word whatever, like a word or part of a word, like say Ubuntu, it's very interesting to see what comes up. Or even the word segregation or Land Act, sometimes they're mixed in English. It's very interesting to see, because you see us also in terms of looking for a topic.
Absolutely, yeah. I think what I'll do is I'll send out that link on our to our postgrad lists. Marijke, you've helped, I'm sure, to light some fires in some of our minds and our research projects. So thank you so much for doing this, and thank you to you all for doing this. We'll see you in a few weeks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.